I just moved the coffee back to the desk. The fat cat hadn't been here for a while, Socrates hadn't been here. And as soon as I do, he wants to come back onto the desk.
No, take it. Not a problem.
Okay.
We are a pet-friendly podcast.
Yeah. No, I just don't want him spilling the drink. So I have to keep it over here, keep it away from him, or keep him up. Anyway. Yeah, some of my experiences on the ground there were so alienating. I mean, there's so many places where just walking around like, who the hell are these people? Like, how the hell are these Jews doing this? Like, it really hits you very hard that it's a fundamentally different world. But I really want people to understand that it's not something that's fundamental to Judaism. Large parts of the country where, God, it's like I feel deeply uncomfortable being anywhere near it, because they, even to other Jews, they can be horrific people, like really distrustful, prejudiced. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of places where I was okay. Fun thing here. There are some places like, okay, so the Dome of the Rock, for example, up in the Haram al-Sharif. Technically, non-Muslims aren't even supposed to get in there, right? It's a shrine reserved to Muslims, and yet I got in very easily.
Me too.
There's a whole lot of places where I wasn't welcome, like, because I'm there studying settlers and studying their movements here, and like they pick up pretty fast that I don't belong in their little universe, and they are belligerent. I mean, the only people who actually did me physical harm in the country were always Zionists. I mean, I was driven off the road at one point. Somebody like turned their car toward me and tried to kill me.
Jesus Christ!
I had somebody take shots at me. I mean, there's some really scary people in parts of that country, and people like me who don't share their views are a threat. There's that paranoia that comes back out, and it's really sad, because I think that Jews and Palestinians together could have created a beautiful society. That it really, it's a lost opportunity.
It was. I constantly think back of what could have been had it not gone down that road. There was so many Jews who were just thankful to be living in a safe land amongst the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. The Palestinians were thankful for the Jewish people who were living among them to bring in different ideas from Europe, bring in different perspectives. And we had pictures of that, glimmers of that. And then these just came along. These motherfuckers just came along and just infiltrated and just created this shit. And I just think about, man, it could have happened. It could have happened.
Whether it was the binational form or the socialist or communist forms, there are so many other visions of how this could have turned out that would not have caused the catastrophe that's fallen on the Palestinians. And it's so sad to me that we lost those roads not taken. And it's one of the reasons that I'm so fired up to try and to change that, to push us back in those directions.
Yes. Anything you need from me, Doc, I'll take orders, for real. I love that, because I'm thinking along the same heart. So let's get into good old fashioned anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
I'm going to play a video that Greg Stoker did a little over a week ago. I was actually out fishing with my son, and I get a text from Greg saying, hey, people are getting really stupid in the comment section, and we need to address this. I said, hey, should we call the doc? He said, call him, arrange it. And I said, that's why I reached out to you, and I said, help me, Obi-Wan O'Mara, your only hope to untangle this fucking mess. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video. 1 second.
Hey guys, you got to stop posting this anti-Semitic BS. It's reductive and lacks any sort of historical nuance. This whole Jews make up 2% of the population but hold these senior staff positions has no bearing on anything in terms of U.S. foreign policy. Yeah, AIPAC's a thing, but the U.S. has supported the Israeli project for almost 100 years for solely imperialist interests. Secular capitalism. Here's a declassified CIA report from 1947, the current situation in Palestine. Palestine is a small, weak country whose war potential is almost non-existent, but whose geographic position gives it a strategic significance out of all proportion to its size and wealth. Significance stems not only from its location at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, its proximity to the Suez Canal, it's also an outlet for Middle Eastern oil. To preserve the U.S. position in the Middle East and to counter Soviet infiltration, political and economic and social stability must be maintained in the area. The enemy is imperialism. It's always been imperialism. This other stuff is just anti-Semitic.
Okay, Doc, we're dealing with some stupid shit, and I'm going to tell you before I hear your opinion on it, I just want to give you my perspective on things. If you're anti-Semitic and you're in this movement, get the fuck out. We don't need you here. This is not helping. If you're being genuinely anti-Semitic, other side of that is if you're coming in this movement with anti-Semitism, even if it's a dog whistle, I'm going to tell you right now that I'm highly suspicious of you, because we know that one of the tactics used by Israeli propaganda is to insert people in the movement to spread rumors like this, dog whistles, to try to delegitimize the movement. So we've seen this before in the Black Lives Matter movement, when we had Black Lives Matter protesters who were protesting peacefully, and out of nowhere, they would see these strange flyers being passed around saying, hey, let's go to the white neighborhoods and start, invading these white homes. Immediately, BLM protesters caught on to it, and they said, who is passing this shit around? And they were able to trace it back to a white supremacist group that had infiltrated the BLM movement. So we do know that these tactics are used. So I'm just going to say straight up that when you start spreading this shit, I am automatically suspicious of you, that you are coming from somebody who's paying you. You are coming from that side of things. But for the sake of talking to the doc here, I want to talk about genuine anti-Semitism that often infiltrates the conversation, gets blended in with anti-Zionism, and all the in-betweens of anti-Semitism, the various forms, the various causes, and such. So, Doc, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, as a start, I'd say that it's entirely possible that some of that kind of rhetoric coming in would come out of a sort of Zionist source intent on delegitimizing the Palestinian cause, since the actual introduction of anti-Semitic discourses has, for literal decades now, deeply harmed the pro-Palestine movement. There's a lot of places where it has reared its head over many decades now. And they know that. They know that if there's any anti-Semitic dog whistle showing up in a Palestine protest, that it's going to send chills down the spine of diaspora Jews. And they know that we are the single biggest threat to the existence of Israel as an ethnocracy. If diaspora Jews get a clue as to what this government is like, we will insist that it change. And there's no way to sustain it without it. I mean, the Christian Zionist movement alone is like numerically much larger than the Jewish population is that supports Israel, but they wouldn't be able to get away with the level of support if Jews were the ones saying, this is bad, fix this shit. And they know that. So they're trying to make us nervous. But I do think, and I would die on this hill, I think a significant part of it is actually infiltration of actually anti-Semitic far-rightists who are trying to piggyback on this. Why some far-right figures are perfectly comfortable being pro-Palestinian all of a sudden. Think about your, Candace Owens assholes or whatever. I mean, this is somebody who has publicly defended 1930s Nazi Germany. So coming out as pro-Palestine, I'm like, yeah, I know where that's coming from.
I know for a fact that Ku Klux Klan members. What's that new stupid ass one? The Patriot Front, the latest edition of white supremacy, wearing their blue polos and their khakis. Really stupid movement, but nonetheless, we do see those anti-Semites slowly infiltrating into the pro-Palestinian movement, spewing out these dog whistles. And there are little white supremacist groups that believe in starting a race war. So they will come in and do that kind of thing. We have fanatics out there, and unfortunately, they have access to the internet.
Yeah, so, the problem here is that if somebody is saying something about a group that you also have a problem with, even if your problem is, political, economic, whatever, like the issue in Israel there, if somebody has come out there and saying a bunch of shit, then it's that makes sense. That just makes sense. Like when people were calling out, okay, so I can get to this. We can get into more detail in this particular aspect of it much later, but if you want, but like, I have to give some credit to some of the leadership in Hamas learning some lessons from some mistakes they made early on, because their early covenant is deeply anti-Semitic and is literally quoting the protocols of the Elders of Zion and accepting that there are worldwide Jewish conspiracies. And the reason they fell into that, it makes a certain amount of sense, but they've been trying to learn and to change that. So their 2017 version removes all the shit that was in the 88 version that had that stuff in there that was so problematic. But there are members of the group that have continued to defend it all the way to the present. When people say, hey, look, this protocol shit is literally false. It's an anti-Semitic forgery from Russia. Why is it in here? And someone will just say, based on their own experience, their own feelings, well, it seems like it's true to me, so it's true, and they'll defend that. It gets to be very difficult to get rid of these ideas once they're in circulation. It's one of the reasons they're quite pernicious. So I do think a lot of it is both the accidental importation of these tropes by otherwise well-meaning people, and there's also a sense of deliberate infiltration by far-rightist elements. So it's probably a large mix of all three of these. So I'll include some space for the one that you put out there, but I don't think it's a majority of the problem. I think a much bigger problem is our own internal tendency in pro-Palestinian circles to uncritically accept some of the arguments because they just don't know where they come from or they don't see the similarities. And there's a couple of those we can definitely get into, like where we see modern variants, in pro-Palestine rhetoric that are actually recycling old anti-Semitic tropes. So it's just because it sounds right. But this is why the far right is dangerous, because they are seeding some of their stuff in there, and then it morphs into a form that's more easily accepted among otherwise people.
And another effective aspect of this form of anti-Semitism is that it is very good at shifting us away from the real problem, the real conspiracy theory that's going on, and that'd be white supremacy and white supremacist imperialism.
Yeah,
that is a conspiracy that is absolutely real.
Absolutely.
Anti-Semitism is just another, I guess, it's another vehicle in which to carry that. It's another vehicle in which to, you bring about the effective means of what imperialism does. It works for Zionists, and it works against Jewish people, and it works against Palestinians. And I have had Palestinians come up to me, and this is why I feel very passionate about talking about this too, is because so many of my Palestinian friends have come up to me and said, listen, this anti-Semitism that we're seeing in the movement, coming from the American side, we don't know where it's coming from, and it's really frustrating because it is taking the spotlight off of what's happening to people in Gaza and putting it on a conspiracy theory. So Palestinians have gone out of their way to tell me, do whatever you can to get rid of this anti-Semitism in the movement, because we don't want it. It doesn't belong. It's nowhere part of our movement at all.
I hear the same.
Just do what you can.
Yeah, I hear the same.
And I'm
people. Yep.
Yeah. So it's not. Besides the fact that this is a problem, it's also the fact that Palestinians are personally requesting that this be squashed in the bud. So if you respect Palestinians, if you respect what's happening to Gazans, get rid of this. That's another great start of doing that. So,
absolutely. And I hope that enough people that are Palestine supporters will see this and think about this and really consider some of the problems around this, because I've heard the same kind of thing from a number of people who do get that. There's actually one other group that's already asked me to try to schedule time with them for like an educational series, helping them to recognize the different tropes and whatnot, because they're noticing the problem. And this is itself an important, improvement in sophistication in the pro-Palestine movement, because for a long time, it wasn't as aware of how this stuff was really hurting its own cause. That is not only accepting racist arguments, but it was deeply harmful to the Palestinian movement, because as soon as you scare away diaspora Jews, then they're not going to hear the rest of your argument. There's no way that someone's going to listen to you about all the problematic racism in Israel if you're prefacing it with a bunch of racism of your own, because that makes them think, well, Israel may be bad, but I at least need that to feel safe, because otherwise the world is always going to turn on Jews and kill us. Yeah,
far right Zionism feeds off of this type of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, exactly. And
they feed on each other.
It's difficult to overcome. So, because again, most American Jews are solidly liberal or leftist. It's only a small share of them that are outspokenly conservative. And liberal people in general, and leftists in particular, do not like ethno-nationalism and racism. And they can be very outspoken in tons of other contexts, but they will over and over and over again defend Israel as it is, because they don't have enough knowledge of the legal structure inside. They believe a lot of the propaganda about how Israel takes care of its own minorities and isn't super racist. And, so they believe like your brochure version, like the one you fell for. But the bigger issue here is the generational trauma and the way that it plays on the fears. If they hear arguments about Jews' dual loyalty and all these different tropes that come up about Jewish control of this, that, or the other thing, then it makes them think we need a place like Israel that we can always go to in case shit goes down. We need our bunker to retreat to. So if we want to break that argument, if you want to get past that emotional barrier, we have to get this rhetoric out completely. We have to have our movement calling it out forcefully.
And I see this happening. I think the pro-Palestinian movement has been very good at it. However, there's a lot of work to do, because it still slips in. The dog whistles still come in. And when you look at the comments section, for example, on Greg's video, you'll see the most brightest minds of the pro-Palestinian movement coming in to crush anybody who wants to slip in some anti-Semitism. So in that regard, I'm glad that we've had this controversy happen as a result of his video. I'm glad he made the video, because it brought all the anti-Semites to the surface. It's like, come on up. If you're anti-Semitic, come on, let's hear you talk for a little bit. Boom, get the fuck out. Boom, get the fuck out. You have no place in this. And I'm glad that he stirred the pot to see these little bubbles come up, because I want to see these bubbles come up, because I know where they're coming from. And, being growing up, in the evangelical community, you see these types of things pop up. And it's one of those things that they latch on to the pro-Israel movement. They are completely anti-Jewish. They're completely anti-Semitic. They're completely Islamophobic. But when the Israel topic gets brought up, I can see that they try to be pro-Israeli, but not for pure reasons. They're pro-Israeli for anti-Semitic reasons and Islamophobic reasons, and I see that infiltrating it. So, I'm glad we're talking about this.
Dude, like, Richard Spencer is pro-Israel.
Yeah, Richard Spencer, a white supremacist, is pro-Israel.
Why?
He's obviously anti-Semitic.
The Jews out of his country, and they go there, and what are they going to do there? They're going to attack Muslims. So...
Oh my God!
A 1-2 punch for white supremacy. So it's really fucking toxic for us to let this shit in.
I am so glad you brought up Spencer. I should have been using him as an example from the get-go. Boom! A light bulb just fucking came on, Doc. I am going to use that. He's the quintessential essence. The quintessential essence. That's a fucking redundant statement. But he is the. Again, help me out with my language ability, Doc. I'm terrible at speaking. I need to study you more. But he, I suck. I suck at this podcasting thing with how I talk. But I'm doing my best here. He's the essence of what exactly what we're talking about. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's really, really harmful to let that shit in. And but the problem is it's easy for people to see someone with his little fashy haircut and his snapping his like Bellamy salutes and like, okay, yeah, we don't want that. but then when somebody in a keffiyeh makes exactly the same argument and uses the same trope, we hear it differently. And that's the danger, is that we're putting a smiley face on some genuinely toxic arguments. So the key here for me in a discussion like this, one of the things I most want to do is help to dissect some of the tropes that I see taking on new guises, new forms within our rhetoric that we need to be aware of, and how the version that you think is okay is actually just a retelling of this same earlier conspiracy. Yeah. But in addition to that, there's also a question of the origins of that kind of hatred, as well as defining it at all. And, and I'm not sure what order you want to tackle things like that, because we do have a basic definitional issue with it. We should know where this stuff comes from and how these ideas took root in the first place. But then we have the house cleaning inside. And I don't know how you want to approach
Doc, if you're asking a guy like me to lay out the order of intellectual conversations about these things, you are asking the wrong guy. You go in whatever order you want.
It's more a matter of the rhetorical effect. So thinking as a podcaster, which you are and I am not, what would most hook somebody and keep them listening so that they get this stuff? Like what, or is there something that we have to do before we get, I don't know, like what would help,
Well, we can try to touch base on, I think a great place to start personally is let's go back to Christian anti-Semitism, how it connects to the mid 19th century to now. So break it up into that 3 parts, and anything in between you want to do. Maybe that's a good start.
Yeah, no, and that for me then, just as a historian, makes the most sense, because in terms of making, a scholarly argument, you'd have to deal with origins and definitions first before you can make sense of the tropes. But I do want to make sure that the audience is going to be along for the ride, because we do have to do this important housekeeping. But I also want to make sure the arguments are clear and people know why they shouldn't be using this rhetoric. And to some extent, the history really helps with that. Because if you can see how it's done, but how it's been used before and what damage it's done,
the audience is going to take our podcast for whatever it's worth to them. For the ones who want to get down to the nuance and start with the history of it, they're going to be down for that. For the ones who aren't, that's on them. The way I do this podcast is, or the way me and Greg do it is, here's what the podcast is, here's the content. Whoever wants to sit by and listen to this can. If not, they can't. They only want to listen to certain parts of it. It's regardless. That's not going to affect how we dive into it or the weeds that we get into.
Okay, can we pause for just a minute? I'm going to let the dog out. She's an old lady.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh goodness! I actually do need a couple more minutes, and just as I need a couple more.
What'd you say?
I need a couple more minutes, and just as a fun point to, I don't know, anyone watching that loves animals and wants animals around, they do age, and sometimes when you get old, you can't control your bowels anymore.
Yeah.
So please don't lose patience with your old animals, because they do care. They're trying. She's trying to let me know, but it just falls out. And she can't get. So I know I've got some messes to pick up, because
hey, Doc,
very old.
No worries. I want to introduce you to my or reintroduce you to my puppy whenever you're done.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so, I'm gonna clean some of this stuff up because it's stinking.
Take your time. No rush. Yeah, I want to. You've probably seen her a long time ago. I don't know how long ago. A month ago. There she is now.
Aww.
She's gotten big. Yeah. Still potty training her slowly, but she's gotten better.
Yeah, you're at the beginning of the journey. I'm at the end.
Yeah,
but it is important for people to, I guess, go into this with a lot of patience, and not blame the dog. Dogs, quite unlike cats, because we bred dogs, they want to please. They want to follow the rules that the pack leader sets. So she knows what she's supposed to do. She has her rules. She's trying and she's doing her best. And if you get angry about the messes, then it's just going to hurt them more psychologically because they already know they're doing something wrong. And at a certain point, dogs will choose to die and just stop eating because they're depressed that they can't keep up with things anymore. She still has a very youthful attitude and really wants to be around, but she just can't do things anymore. And I want to keep that around. I don't want her to be depressed by her aging, because I know that she already knows she's messing up. And even when she's already like dropped the deuce on my floor, she's still asking to go out because she knows that that's what she's supposed to do, you know?
No, it's really
hard. I mean, I know it's inconvenient. I know it'll bother people, but please, if this ever happens to you with your old animals, anybody watching this kind of stuff, try to control your reactions. You know, because it'll really, really help them psychologically. They do know. An old dog knows that she's not supposed to do it. She's not doing it on purpose. I have a really bad memory of an experience like that. My childhood best friend, actually my ex-wife too. I married the high school sweetheart out of that. But her father at one point took the family cat and dumped him at a place that you know, an animal shelter that kills. And as soon as I found out about it, I raced down and tried to get to him, but it was too late and he was already gone. But he believed that Sebastian was peeing on the sofa intentionally just to get mad at him. But the cat was like 16. I mean, he was incontinent, for fuck's sake. He didn't just suddenly decide, I'm going to start peeing on the couch to make you mad. Like, the poor animal couldn't help it. He didn't deserve to be murdered for that. And it's really, that kind of stuff really gets to me.
I bet it does. Yeah, same here. I agree. Yeah.
Anyway, total tangent from the main topic here, but
it's life. I'm glad you added that, you know. Okay. It's always good to take a break from topics like anti-Semitism and Zionism to focus on, you know, the beautiful things in life, the things that actually touch us.
All the love that we get from them, you know. I mean, she's brought love into my life. Yeah, if that means I have to clean up a mess every now and then, so be it. You know.
It's the least of our worries right now.
Right.
You know, with everything going on. Yeah.
Okay, so, ready to dive back into this?
Go ahead, wherever you want to dive.
Alrighty. I want to start with the troubling, with the word itself, anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who write it as anti-Semitism, often with a capital S. That's actually a pet peeve of mine. Because what it's doing is it's giving credence to the racist origins of the term. Because there's no such thing as Semitism, and Semites were never actually the target of the word. This is one problem I've seen in a lot of pro-Palestine circles, is they're trying to say, well, hating Palestinians is anti-Semitic because obviously Arabic is a Semitic language. But anti-Semitism was never about the Semitic languages. Its targets didn't speak a Semitic language. It was invented in the 19th century as a pseudoscientific racist code word to replace other forms of hating Jews. So like, in German, like Judenhass, like you would say, I hate Jews for being Jews. And that worked for a lot of people because of the cultural and theological history in Europe. But in a more enlightened, secular, scientific age, people didn't want to think that they hated a people because they were, I don't know, Christ killers or something. They wanted, a different way to justify or rationalize the hatred that they grew up with, rather than letting go of that hatred. So they invented a word for it. So since we're stuck with the word, I always make it one single word, lowercase. Because
interesting.
It at least, it acknowledges the fact that we're stuck with this terrible word, but it doesn't fall into giving credence to the racism behind the idea by suggesting that there is a Semitism or Semites or anything around this. It's literally
and you used
Jews.
You used an interesting term in one of your lives where I was paying attention to, in which you were talking about this race science, how that played a role into the word anti-Semitism. Can you just give a very brief description of what race science is for those who may not know?
Yeah, what ends up happening is that a lot of players in the early scientific movements, in early anthropology, early biology, things like that, their thought, their reasoning reflected the imperial logic of their day. So if you're living in the 18th and 19th century at a time when Europeans have risen from their being an obscure backwater to dominating the entire planet, then you want to somehow explain that scientifically. Well, that doesn't make any damn sense. There's nothing to explain there. They're historical contingencies. There are certain structural conditions, certain ideals that spread that allowed Europeans to do what they did that have nothing to do with race or anything else. But it was tempting for people to divide the world up into different races. And race, we have to understand, has always been a flexible social concept. It has no basis in biology. This is one of the problems I have with a lot of people talking about it today. And I get this even sometimes within the Palestine circles too, but you see it reflected to some degree everywhere. There are people that are actually using a kind of racial essentialism without recognizing it. That they don't notice the subtle ways in which the scientific racism of the 18th and 19th century are still with us. Because before, where we used to use the words much more flexibly, like the German race versus the French race, and it just means a group of people, right? It's taken in to mean a certain biological differences. And people will say, well, it's not racism to attack Jews because Jews are white people. And like, well, no, you're making a category of whiteness and saying that's a race, and that's literally racist. It's bullshit. It doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as a black race or a white race or anything else in scientific terms. Because today we have access to genetics. We know, for example, and I love this as an example because it really gets to the heart of it, I think, for a lot of people. If you look at the physical features of a lot of people in sub-Saharan East Africa, so say like Tanzania, Kenya, and then in sub-Saharan West Africa, say Ghana, Nigeria, they look very similar to a lot of American eyes. But they are genetically more different from each other than they are from white Europeans. There's no genetic basis whatsoever to race. It's literally nonsensical. The genes that actually control the amount of melanin, the skin tone, right? It's present in all of us. So my distant descendants, if we continue to live in this area, will darken over thousands of years.
Right.
Just like the original inhabitants of most of Northern Europe were actually very dark-skinned. The original inhabitants of Britain were dark-skinned because they migrated out of Africa, where you're closer to the sun, like in the equator, so darker skin is an adaptation to that. And over time, they lightened because you have less access to sun, you need to suck in more vitamin D, all the rest of that. So it's just nonsensical to think that these races really exist. But in the 18th and 19th century, so from the typologies you get with, say, Blumenbach, in Germany, all the way through into like the middle of the 19th century, people like Ernst Haeckel, like you're breaking down the different races of humanity and how they all relate to the other apes and whatnot. And they were saying, oh, look, Africans are more like blah, blah, blah. It's nonsense. Everything about it. I mean, all the, if anybody's run into like the phrenology shit, they're all pseudoscience.
This type of science was weaponized and used, just like just like religion was used as a tool for racism. Exactly. So was science, and people don't realize. People automatically think that, well, the racism was a battle between people who thought reasonably and thought scientifically versus people who thought religiously. And it's like, no, they both shared in the imperial racism at the time. And we saw a glimpse of that. I don't know if you saw the movie Django Unchained with the Quentin Tarantino. Okay, a perfect scene that captured this race science was when Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Mr. Candy, he had brought out a skull that says, as you can see, the skull of the African, this little part right here, and analyzing it. That's why Tarantino's a genius when he does historical references, is because that was a very accurate portrayal of the science of the slavery period. Yeah. And so this idea that racism is just cordoned off to religious ignorance or religious fanaticism, no, it spanned the liberal world as well. You know, white liberalism is full of racism based on race science.
Yeah, for sure. Like, take the basic question of evolution by natural selection, right? If you go today into a bookstore and look for a reprint of Darwin's On the Origin of Species, you're going to get a copy of the first edition. It went through 6 editions in his lifetime, but none of the other ones stay in print. And it's not the later ones that they kept in print. They always go back to the first, because every single edition, he watered down his own theory because people were trying to introduce these different progressive elements. And progressive meaning like history moves in a particular direction, and we're heading toward the perfection of humanity. But natural selection just branches off, based upon very narrow factors like your adaptability to a particular environment. There's no sense of being higher or lower. It doesn't make sense. I mean, jellies haven't evolved much in a long freaking time because they work perfectly. Sharks haven't changed in hundreds of millions of years because they work perfectly. There's no directionality to it. It's just a matter of what works well. But people wanted to think that humans were higher than other mammal forms, and more, and that things would naturally trend toward, that greater complexity, things would get better and better. And of course, they wanted, to put white people up on top, and, and all that's bullshit. It's really, so you could put Darwin's ideas in the middle of the 19th century, but Darwinism doesn't really take root until the middle of the 20th. With the neo-Darwinian synthesis that introduces Mendelian genetics and tons of other things that help to make it clear that no, he was right the first time. All the rest of this is bullshit. But in that century in between, there were so many competing forms of science trying to explain things that all had the cultural biases, toward greater perfection, and all that reflects their dominance in the world at the time. So there was a lot of actually racist science, and commendably, there's a lot of scientists who were criticizing this pretty early on. I mean, late 19th, early 20th century, there are a lot of good early anthropologists who are saying, yeah, this racism shit, this is complete bullshit. But the dominant trends were racist as hell because of, as your podcast is often about, imperialism and the logic of empire trying to justify the power that it had over people, economically and politically, by adding all these different cultural and scientific dimensions to rationalize it. And ultimately, that's the context for the development of anti-Semitism as a distinct discourse in the 19th century, is that racism. It's a form of racism. But it's not the origins of disliking Jews at all. And it's one of the things I also have kind of a pet peeve for people applying the term anti-Semitism to periods before that. So there's actually a great book by an Anglican priest called Christian Anti-Semitism. That it's a very commendable portrait of the church's long history of attacks on Jews and the rationales for it. But the title is cringy for me because he's discussing anti-Judaism, not anti-Semitism.
Right.
The theological basis isn't actually anti-Semitic. I have always tended to prefer terms like Judeophobia.
I like that better.
Yeah,
because it goes in the category of Islamophobia. Exactly. Like the fact that we've developed a special form of racism towards Jews. Yeah. It's just racism, because I feel like if you word it like Judeophobia, the problem with that plays for the Zionists is, well, then we can start saying Islamophobia and Palestinian phobia, they're phobias, they're forms of racism. If we categorize anti-Semitism as just racism, or as
which it is a form of racism, and yeah, they're fundamentally irrational. They're based in a kind of xenophobic fear of difference. So the hatred of Muslims for being Muslim and of Jews for being Jewish has the same origin in Christian fears of the other. And it should be treated the same way, as a kind of irrational phobia, rather than taken seriously. When we use the term anti-Semitism, to some extent, we're still recycling race science, because it's literally a bullshit term invented by scientific racists to make the Jews a distinct race that can be hated.
The word has always confused me. When I first heard the word anti-Semitic, off the bat, it confused me, because I'm just like, you mean racism towards Jews? It's like, wait, it has a special word designated for racism against Jews? It's anti-Semitic? I'm like, why did we do that? Like, why did we put it in a special category over here when it should be grouped up with all the other forms of bullshit racism? It should not be treated any differently.
Exactly. So, yeah. And it realistically, in the scholarly discourse, it never is. Anti-Semitism is always discussed as literally a form of racism, which is why it has its origins in the 19th century and not earlier. But fear of Jews has been around for as long as Jews have lived among other peoples. There are attacks on Jews that definitely predate the rise of Christianity, but they're not systemic and they don't become general cultural things. Some people like to point to, the Esther story, in the Bible, the one that gives us Purim and whatnot. But we know that it's actually not historical, that it's not actually referring to real events. All the details in the story make it clear that it's just not a historical event. So we can set that one aside for a minute here. One of the most clear early examples you can see is in the Seleucid period. Seleucus the First Nicator, he was one of the Alexander's generals and one of the beneficiaries when his empire was carved up. And he creates his own, Seleucid dynasty. And when he combined elements of the veneration of the ruler that you got from the Persians with the original city cult that the Greeks had, he invented emperor worship, which the Romans later borrowed from him. And this idea of an important ritual, you have to honor this government here religiously. Well, the Jews wouldn't do that because they were already monotheists by that point. So fuck that, we're not going to do this. And he ends up outlawing Judaism, attacks people, takes over the temple and reconsecrates it to Zeus, all kinds of horrifying shit. But that prejudice doesn't last. And it was really unusual in the classical world, because what it is it's laying down some of the threads that would eventually lead to the kind of culture going to develop in Roman Christianity, in the later Roman Empire, rather than reflecting the more common pagan polytheistic senses that are always much more inherently okay with diversity. Think about the same ultimate origins, like the Ptolemaic dynasty that ends up ruling Egypt for a long time, also founded by one of the generals of Alexander. And the Ptolemies gave tons of money to the Jewish community of Alexandria, sponsored the translation of the Bible into Greek. I mean, had no problem whatsoever with them. But what ends up happening as you start developing the Christian ideal, there's an important twist here. And it's not something that would have been fundamental to Christianity if not for its connection to political power in the Roman state. Because Christianity has its origins as a sect in Judaism. There are a lot of competing apocalyptic trends in the first century. It was a very common way of dealing. Why are we under foreign occupation? What's the point of continuing to be Jewish? Anything else? Why should we do this? And people are looking for an answer that gives them some kind of purpose, some kind of meaning, some sense, God has a plan. So there's all these different movements that spring up there, right, within Judaism. And Christianity is one of those. It's one of these competing movements. And all the early followers were Jews. If you read the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus was a Torah Jew, didn't break any Torah commandments at all. But in the first few centuries that follow that, it starts to spread outside of Palestine in the rest of the Roman world. And it's taking on an ideal that it's more important to save souls and convert people to Jesus's message than it is to stay Jewish. So they slowly start dispensing with elements of Judaism in it. But it's really complex in its first couple of centuries in its relationship to Judaism, and many movements in Christianity for centuries remained Jewish. They stayed as Torah Jews who also believed that Jesus was Messiah and everything else. Eventually, though, the form that's going to start infiltrating the Roman upper classes has no relation to it at all. And in that, you end up having to, well, think about it a little bit differently. If you make the Romans the bad guy, then how does this religion spread in the Roman world? How does it get to anybody at all, and realistically, the Romans would have been the only ones in a position to execute Jesus. They were the actual political authority. No Jews had the political power to do so, and crucifixion is literally a punishment for crimes against the state. And being Messiah, given that Messiah is a political concept in Judaism, somebody throwing off foreign occupation and fixing things. Yeah. Well, if he's not denying he's a Messiah, then he's going to be executed for sedition. But you can't go around saying the Romans killed God and then have Romans convert to it, non-Jewish Romans convert to it.
So you put the blame on the Jews and get the Romans to adopt it.
Well, you've got the great line, let his blood be upon us and upon our descendants, like the Jews.
So is that was the birth of the Passion play? This idea the Passion theatrics?
Yeah, which stays quite violent towards Jews throughout medieval Christian history. But yeah, this whole idea of the Passion of Christ, the death and suffering there, they shift the blame onto the Jewish community and away from the Romans and ignore the fact that Jesus and his followers were all Jews.
We're Jewish, yeah.
Right. But they kind of make it look like Jesus actually did something to piss off the Jewish authorities, but realistically he didn't. The only people he's ever really arguing with are the Pharisees, and Jesus's movement is, quite frankly, Pharisaic in its dimensions, because the Pharisees were the faction in this period that were calling for a decentralized approach to worship. They created the synagogue movement. They were saying that you don't need all the priesthood and the temple and all the rituals. If you just get some believers together, we can talk to God. We can pray on our own. It can be a much more personal relationship with God, versus like the Sadducees' adherence to like the temple structure and the formal priesthood and everything else. So he's arguing with them, but that kind of argument is just normal in Judaism over interpretation, right? Of course he's going to call it for hypocrisy and everything else.
And plus, the Jewish authority at the time is under occupation by the Romans. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes what we see is like you got a King Herod who, technically he's Jewish, but at the end of the day, he was just Rome's little bitch. So the Jewish authority at the time, they were simply more or less, controlled opposition to the Romans. Like whoever the Romans wanted to be in power over the Jewish community, that's who would be in power over the Jewish community. So
even beyond that, at this point, Herod's already gone, and when Herod's heirs fought over who would be in charge, the Romans just said "fuck it" and made it a province of the empire. And so this is the year 6. So 30 years before Jesus is out there preaching, it's literally a province of the empire with an appointed governor. So Jews have literally no authority to do anything against him, but they can argue against him. The problem there is that if you're going to say that the Jewish authorities were angry at Jesus, you got to show why. And he actually doesn't violate any Torah laws in the Synoptic Gospels. If anything, if they actually convened a court to talk about him, as it says that they did, that's taking place during Passover, which means they would have been breaking Jewish law, not Jesus. It doesn't make any fucking sense, but it becomes an important element of early Christianity that the Jews are Christ killers. And especially by the 4th century, when Jesus definitively becomes God, because this was actually a minority view early on, that Jesus was himself divine and not a prophetic figure, not a messianic figure in the Jewish sense. When his divinity is recognized and enshrined in things like the Council of Nicaea, at that point, the accusation takes on a much more potent problem, which is why in the 4th and 5th century you start to see the first significant pogroms against Jews, because now they haven't just attacked the Messiah, they've literally murdered God. And that charge of deicide has reverberated through the millennia. It's not until the 1960s that the Catholic Church officially removes it, and some Catholics, like Mel Gibson, were such assholes that they broke away from the church just to keep hating Jews. I mean, it was a significant part of its theology for a very long time. There are ways in which it gets challenged by some people. So think about the Protestant Reformation again. You know, Luther initially was very enthusiastic about the Jews, hoped that his version of Christianity would be appealing to them. They'd all convert to it. Oh, we're not like the Catholics, and we're not saying all this other crap about you, so you'll convert, right? And when the Jews were like, nah, bro, we're not into the Jesus thing, he turned viciously anti-Jewish and started writing a bunch of pamphlets attacking the Jews, which meant that it got baked into Protestantism as well.
That's the unfortunate thing. So you had the anti-Judaism in the Catholic Church. Okay, you have this guy who reforms Christianity,
right?
You know, creates Protestantism. All right, fresh start. We can keep anti-Semitism and Jew hating and all that out of it. No, we gotta go. We gotta just now grab one of the worst parts about Catholicism, bring it into that group, and now we have a whole new birth and a whole new timeline of Jew hating. Yeah, and then I believe Adolf Hitler was a huge fan of Martin Luther.
for those writings, for sure, yeah. Again, even though he's of a Catholic background, but yeah, definitely, those specific writings of Luther were quite popular in Germany still.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is, because Luther kicks off the whole Protestant movement, all the other early Protestant variants, they take in his logic about this, and they retain the anti-Judaic elements of Christianity, which means that in the long run, all these earlier elements of hatred that had built up. So, and there's a ton of these that build up across the Middle Ages. So, I don't know if you think about in, okay, so we've heard of I don't know, people have heard of the blood libel, the accusation of Jews committing ritual murder.
Oh, yeah.
So
that was common propaganda in Nazi Germany, correct?
The Nazis used it for sure. Yeah. It has its origins in about the 12th century, and it spreads widely after that, and it never really goes away. The core of it is that when, I don't know, some Christian kid is missing, right? You know, because, I don't know, hey, it's the Middle Ages. He might have gotten eaten by wolves or fell down a well and died. Who the hell knows, right? Kids do stupid shit and disappear. But
they do stupid shit, especially in the medieval times.
Where's my son? The Jews must have gotten him. And they argued that the Jews every now and then have to ritually murder a Christian child in order to drain his blood to make Passover matzah. So,
wow.
If anybody's ever seen those flat, tasteless ass crackers that we have to eat at Passover,
that's what it is. It's a Christian child. That's why it tastes so tasteless.
And it tells you how little they know about any of this stuff, because one of the core principles of Jewish kosher law is not consuming blood in any form.
Yeah.
Even from kosher animals, you can't consume blood or blood organs.
It's literally one of the commandments. You shall not eat anything with blood in it, for its lifeblood is where its spirit. And yet they said, well, Jews clearly are using Christian blood to make this bread or whatever, and it just sticks around. And the saddest thing is, okay, so give me a place where you can still see this stuff showing up in the contemporary world. The blood libel exists across the Arab world today, where it didn't before. It's only imported in the late 19th century and starts to make its inroads there. And you can see some of this going back to the French occupation of Algeria, and the way they started separating the Jewish population from the rest of the Arab and Berber populations and giving them special privileges. So people began importing some of this awful shit, and it really spread across the 20th century. Syrian state television used to broadcast a little movie every now and then that redid the story of a Jew taking a good Muslim child and draining his blood to, again, ritual murder. Like it's still around, which is fucking sad. Yeah.
And then, I don't know, other shitty ones that show up later, like the okay, so the bubonic plague is spreading around, right? So the Black Death is ravaging Europe in the 14th century. Well, who could have caused it? Clearly the Jews did. The Jews poisoned the wells, and therefore...
And then you come to find out it was because of their ritual cleansing their what do I say? Their ritual bathing that they do, the ritualistic cleaning of hands that kept them from getting contaminated by the bubonic plague, and therefore that was associated with. Yeah. Or no, maybe not. Maybe
really, it's because it's spread by fleas, moving this around anyway. They were susceptible to it too. Anybody was able to catch this shit, but the Jewish populations were relatively small, and they tend to be quite isolated. So they weren't hit in the same way because of their isolation. And but even when they were hit, it didn't really matter because, again, at the end of the day, this why I like Pinsker's term Judeophobia. I think it's inherently irrational. It didn't matter that they were hit. They still caused it. And this idea of Jews causing harm to other people, you can see that in the way some people play with that goy concept. They separate themselves from everybody else. They don't like anybody else. They look to harm other peoples. There's ways in which it keeps being recycled in different ways. And a lot of that will play a part in some of the most extreme forms of anti-Semitism that will develop in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. When you start adding all these different secular dimensions to it is when it gets like really over the top fucked up. But what you've got here is two distinct forms: are anti-Judaism, which has a theological basis, and anti-Semitism, which has that nationalistic and scientific racist sense. So it has to show up later for the men of science and reason who keep wanting to hate Jews. Well, here's a way you can keep hating Jews. You can think of them as an inferior race that's out to get you. And they end up merging together in a way. So all the way as late as you think about the Shoah, the Holocaust, right? A lot of the people participating in it didn't do so because they believed the Nazis' racist arguments. A lot of them weren't even aware of them. A lot of people simply signed up to help kill Jews because they were good Lutherans or Catholics, and of course they grew up hating Jews because it was perfectly okay, perfectly acceptable to hate Jews. I mean, there's a cathedral, that has sculptures on the outside of it of Jews fucking pigs, like really horrible shit. Like this kind of like attacks on Jews were just normal. They were completely culturally normalized in a way that really should scandalize people today. It really only after the Holocaust that we start pushing back against this kind of hatred, and honestly, we did that in a really bad way too. I do want to make a point about that later if we can, because I think the way that the Holocaust is experienced actually causes some other problems. We instead of actually dealing with what caused it, it affects the Israel-Palestine conflict. Anyway, I don't want to get into that right now. Thinking about the anti-Semitic tropes that develop here, there's a lot of them that have their origins in explicitly anti-Semitic works in the 19th and early 20th century that do continue to make their way into our spaces.
Well, what's interesting is that they're grasping for the conspiracy that's connecting all this together. And to an extent, yes, there is a conspiracy tying all this together. And it does have, in a ways, a relationship to how, they're putting Jewish people as human shields in front of this, but the man behind the curtain is white imperialism. It's white. It's this white supremacist imperialism that does want to control all the resources. It's all about the money, baby, and it has nothing to if they may have a Jewish person in power or in a position that is working the wheels of that particular department, but just look at that alone. It means that they chose somebody who's Jewish to put them up to use as a human shield for the white imperialism that's behind it. That's always been my take on it.
People have just climbed to power anyway within these different systems. It's like when people...
Yeah, white imperialism will use anybody. It will use anybody as the poster child.
People will blame Jews for both the development of capitalism and of socialism at the same time, which is hilarious. And the problem here is that they'll often support that by pointing to, I don't know, for the capitalist part, well, look at all these Jewish billionaires. I'm like, cool, yeah, but they're a minority of billionaires. Like, what are you going to say that? What about all the fucking Christian billionaires? Like, what are you talking about? Like, but
The Christian billionaires.
They want to tie them to it. So they'll point to Jewish billionaires, and then they'll point to people like Marx, and what they're doing is they're just trying to point to anything that anybody might consider to be harmful, destructive, whatever, and they want to assign blame for it to a particular group. But that whole process, what it does is it ignores what actually happens. It's not racial groups that came up with either of these things. They both evolved historically for particular purposes. They have nothing to do with like ethnic groups at all. There's no ethnic or religious component to capitalism or socialism, but it ties into this sense that Jews secretly control things. And you see that in arguments that Jews control the media, which is a particular pet peeve of mine. If anybody ever sees the Clown Pepe or the Clown World, hashtag, things like that, Clown World is literally a 4chan neo-Nazi conspiracy.
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. What is that?
What they're doing in this, and it really bothers me that some semi-mainstream people like Candace Owens use terms like Clown World, because they're literally using a neo-Nazi argument. It's that we don't talk about all the bad things black people do because the media can't do that, because the media is controlled by Jews, and Jews want to import people from other countries, and it gets into the whole like Jews will not replace us, Charlottesville kind of shit. Like there's a sense in which Jews are systematically undermining the world by calling for open borders and migration and everything else, and downplaying that black people commit most crimes, all the racist shit they want to talk about. But what they do is they attach Clown World to it. What they're saying is that we don't get to talk about this, and everyone just calls that as racist because they're trying to say, hey, we're not racist, we just know the truth. They're saying this only gets called racist because Jews control the message, they control the media, Jews own all the newspapers or whatever, so that means we can't talk about it. It's literally an anti-Semitic conspiracy that's widespread on the right. And this shows up in our circles when people talk about how you can't talk about the Palestinians in different ways, why the pro-Israel narrative dominates in the media. It's sometimes argued that it's because Jews control the media. Well, no, it's because capital controls the media, and empire affects the media, and all of these different structural features in this country affect the way media has a particular...
I mean, when has the U.S. media never been white supremacist? It's always been white supremacist. And they're latching on to the pro-Israel side because that whole topic centers around white supremacy. We're talking about an indigenous people, the Palestinians, being taken over by a colonial force that's backed by white supremacists who happen to be in very high steps of power, who don't give a shit about Jews. They will use they will use Jews as a human shield any day.
It has the shared cultural DNA of settler colonialism. So there's a parallel there. It's why we can relate, and some Americans can relate to Israel's pioneer ethos, because that's like the settlement of the West. And we thought we were bringing progress through manifest destiny, but that was a racist as fuck imperial project. And so is what happened in Palestine. So there's that similarity, so if you go back to Josiah Strong's argument about the Anglo-Saxon race conquering the prairies in the US here, it sounds a lot like the Zionist narratives, but it has a nice dual purpose for a lot of white supremacist arguments, because while there's that similarity, that parallelism, it also gets rid of the Jews. It gets them there, So it's useful to them. And when we take these things in and suggest that the reason the media is so pro-Israel is because it's controlled by Jews, that's an anti-Semitic conspiracy. That's literally racist. It's physically not true. It's the same thing for Hollywood or movies. Jews control Hollywood. For anybody who likes that kind of shit, South Park did a fun episode on that not too long ago. Where Kyle, does your family control Hollywood? What? But it's nonsensical. Yes, there were a lot of Jews in early Hollywood, because Jews were forced into entertainment because they couldn't do a lot of other professions. So they got good at that. But that blaming people for their success is a long-term history in this kind of supremacist discourses. Look at the way the banking clans themselves were attacked. Most Jews in Europe were dirt poor. They were dirt poor, marginalized peoples that had no status at all, and yet a tiny number of them were wealthy bankers. because some of these people were turned to early on in medieval Europe because the Catholic Church used to forbid lending.
Well, those wealthy bankers did not give a shit about the common Jew.
Oh no,
they didn't give a shit about they were willing to whore themselves out to any white supremacist movement or any colonial movement as long as it made them money.
Capital, yeah, it's class relations. So, but those clans, as they developed in the Middle Ages, they developed because Christians specifically banned lending. So
yeah.
They forced Jews to do it. And whenever Jews got good at that and made some money for themselves, then the countries got pissed, seized all their wealth, and kicked them out of the country. But, they always ended up needing them back. It just, until eventually the church just took away the arguments against usury and allowed lending on interest for Christians. But for a long time, it was banned for Christians. But you're then blaming Jews for something that Christianity created. And again, it's a tiny share of the Jewish population who benefited from this. And yeah, their interests were all class-based. They didn't care about Jews or Zionists.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, the ones that would have been powerful, if they're in the banking industry, it means that they're directly connected to imperialism. Like that's the whole, it's part of it's just one spoke in the whole wheel. There's many spokes in this wheel. Zionism is just one spoke. And that's why I appreciate, even though like of the two of us, I'm the conspiracy guy amongst me and Greg, but while being a conspiracy theorist myself, I appreciate his take on things when it comes to conspiracies. He's like, listen, these conspiracies are nothing more than distractions about what's going on. Like they're not, there's some things you don't necessarily have to point to a conspiracy other than the fact that it is imperialism. It's Eurocentric, Euro-American centric imperialism at the end of the day. That's about as far as you really need to go. If you want to dive into deeper, leave that to guys like me, my dumbass, who will go into those things. But, I appreciate Greg's take on that and your take on that, because it's a distracting thing when we have a genocide going on.
It really is, but even beyond, again, the specific events of today, because this is going to go on for years and years still, and it's been going on for a long time. And whenever people are starting to draw those connections and draw those links like this, they're falling directly into that anti-Semitic territory.
Which, by the way, benefits the imperialist machine when you look the other direction away from it. It's a very good distracting magnet.
Yes, exactly.
It's like, because you're going to have people out there who are going to be curious about, wait, is there a connection going on here? So what it does is it's like a magnet that, you can try to attract people away from the target point, away from the bullseye, keep it focused on the Jews, keep it focused or whatever else, and when in fact it's just, they're, but you're leading into, a good a way to segue into how anti-Semitism evolved and created this ramp for Zionism to take advantage of in its oppression of Palestinians, and how it really cleared a nice ugly monster to look at to scare Jewish people into the prison camp of ethno-Zionism, ethnocentric Zionism.
Well, yeah, the more that the anti-Semitic tropes come back into wide circulation, the more people are supportive of Zionism. The key here, if you actually go back further into American history, early on in this project, most American Jews were not fans of the Zionist movement at all, both before the creation of the state and afterwards. So all the way into the 1960s, it was actually quite controversial to be, a hardcore supporter of Israel and to make Israel like a part of your identity. There was a significant strain of American Judaism that understood this was bullshit colonialism and called it out for it. But the farther we got away from World War II, and the more that these anti-Semitic discourses started creeping back up into public discourses, and honestly, earlier on, a lot of that was sadly driven in the Arab world. There's a ton of shit that's starting to show up in the 60s and 70s and 80s that is deeply and horrifically anti-Semitic, because they're just importing European tropes because they're facing a Jewish enemy These other people talked shit about Jews and said that they were responsible for all these other things. So of course it just made sense to them, and they took these ideas in. Well, what that did was it gave Zionists a way to say, look at the Palestinians. They're just like the Nazis, and we should be worried. And if you don't support us and you don't make support for Israel so important to you, then another Holocaust will happen, and they'll cause it. So It does fall into a trap. And so the more that anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head, the worse the Zionist movement has gotten in relation to the Palestinians, and the deeper it sunk its claws into the diaspora, the way it's affected a lot of Jews' identities. And that has been really harmful too. The video clip that you played, right? When he's criticizing something, the whole 2%, all the rest of that crap.
Yeah.
When they had the names of people in the cabinet, what flag did they put next to them?
Israeli. Right.
Why? Because what they're doing is they're saying the Israeli flag means Jews. So it makes it an immediately anti-Semitic meme, because it's suggesting that these people, because they're Jews, therefore they're Israeli and supporters of Israel and blah, blah, blah. People in Congress support Israel for capitalist and imperialistic reasons and for Christian Zionist reasons. Look at the way this comes up a lot in the Palestine camps, the discussions around AIPAC. And AIPAC is almost invariably discussed as a foreign lobby. AIPAC is a harmful entity because of its imperialist and far-right politics. And
AIPAC is not the only one. The evangelical Zionist lobbies, far more powerful than AIPAC, but they're all one gear of the same fucking machine.
Yeah, they're all pro-Israel, and they dump shit tons of money in it as well. When we focus disproportionately on AIPAC and not on lobbying as a whole, or again, as you keep saying, imperialism and that rhetoric, right? What's ultimately driving it? People only take AIPAC money because they already support those priorities. If they did not support what Israel was doing, they wouldn't take the money.
The amount of money that evangelical lobbyist groups, it dwarfs the amount of money that AIPAC gives. I mean, I was looking at the numbers that AIPAC gives to these politicians, and I'm like, this is chump change. It's honestly chump change compared to what other monies they're given by the energy sector, the industrial war machine sector, our weapons industry. The weapons industry is one of the largest contributors to these guys, but it's money. AIPAC is just, again, another spoke in the wheel of all the money that's going into.
It simply overlaps with a lot of imperial interests. So it has a pernicious character relative to a lot of other ethnic lobbies. But at the end of the day, it is just an ethnic lobby like all the other ones that exist in this country, which means they're literally Americans. I have a hard time with this because on the one hand, I have to come across like I'm defending AIPAC, and I freaking hate these guys because I hate all lobbyists. I think that money in politics has to go. It is the root of so much of the evil in this country. But singling them out and not the other ones is literally anti-Semitic, because it's arguing that Jewish money has a more pernicious character, that it has more power than anything else. And the simple fact is, as wealthy as some American Jews are, we're still a tiny minority, and there's a shitload more money raised by other lobby groups, and they're doing the same things and pushing the same politics and priorities.
And those lobby groups are going to get away scot-free because we're just focusing on AIPAC. So it's like, hey, everybody, they're just looking at AIPAC. Let's just, we're going to be out here in the shadows. It's a great way, again, of getting a magnet. It's the magnet theory.
Right.
You get everybody over here.
Exceptions, right? So it's like, we can make socialism or communism a Jewish thing by pointing to a few Jews and ignore the fact that the vast majority of them are Christians. Or we can say capitalism and all this neoliberalism shit, it's a Jewish thing, and point to a few Jewish capitalists and ignore the fact that the vast majority of them are Christians. Like it's just pulling a few people out and singling them out and pointing to them. And why do you do that? It's because of the anti-Semitic tropes. It's because of how deeply its claws are sunk into Western culture, that it's normalized to single out Jews this way. So I don't defend AIPAC as an organization because I think that their politics and priorities are horrific, and I hate all lobbyists. But when we only talk about AIPAC in this situation, it's it's literally an anti-Semitic trope, especially when people say things like it's a foreign lobby, because that's just the dual loyalty trope. That's arguing that the Jews are loyal to Israel, not to the U.S.
And it allows the others to get off scot-free. It allows them to be completely go undetected, even though there's way more money in those lobby groups, you know.
Right. So again, if you want to attack lobbyists, I'm there with you. I'm happy. All of them should go. AIPAC should be abolished, but they all should be abolished. But it's not. But arguing specifically about that, even though they do play a pretty pernicious role in relation to the Palestine issue, the simple fact remains that those people are taking the money because they already support Israel as an imperial outpost.
Greg and I have been meaning to ask you is how the pro-Palestinian movement can avoid non-conscious anti-Semitism when talking about these issues, because we're dealing at a time of a lot of passion, obviously, but there's a genocide going on. Right. The most innocent of innocent people are getting slaughtered by a Zionist war machine that is nothing more than an extension of the imperialist arm of the United States and other European powers and other European, multinational companies. But it's so in this whole, storm of passions we're getting, it's very fertile territory for anti-Semitism to come on the rise. But I personally think the pro-Palestinian movement has been very good at keeping that at bay. It still exists.
We're getting much, much better at it.
Much better. So how do we continue that trend of being better and weeding it out and keeping it away from the movement? Because the Palestinians definitely don't benefit from it. Anti-Semitism is not going to save the Palestinians who are dying in Gaza right now. So that's a complete disrespect to their memory. But how do we work to eradicate it from the movement and keep it at bay?
There are several parts to this. One is to be cautious about confirmation bias. And when you're hearing things that might sound appealing.
Whenever you have a bloody situation like an imperialist invading force on native territory, there's all kinds of fucked up shit's going to be going on. You're going to have rape. You're going to have organ harvesting. You're going to have theft. You're going to have child trafficking is going to happen. It's all part of the fucking nasty imperialist machine that we see happen. Right. So even if it's true, of course I can see that being used by anti-Semites who want to push that as, part of the whole blood libel conspiracy. But at the end of the day, that's just capitalism in the most fucked up form.
It is in that sense. And it is a way of processing it. And what I would hope that people could do, if they're going to follow along the logic that you're laying out there, is at least set it aside and let's wait for real evidence. Because the problem for me is that a lot of times people jump on things like this that seem like they could happen, and will pass around long discredited nonsensical stories as evidence. We don't have any evidence of that actually happening yet. Right. If it turns out that it did, then we can say, yes, this is the kind of shit that fucked up racist, capitalist, imperialist governments will do. But I would tend to say, let's wait until we can see that it's happened, because there are so many other things that we know happen. I mean, it bothers me that people, okay, so on the one hand, if there's any allegation of sexual assault by members of Hamas during their attack, all of that should be investigated. We should find out the truth of it. They should really have done some really thorough studies, and they didn't. They decided not to actually pursue this evidence-wise because the argument itself is just useful. But if there is a problem, it has to be pursued legally as a violation of the laws. It doesn't justify any of the attacks, anything else, because things like that are crimes, and crimes should be prosecuted. But we ignore, and this shows up over and over again, Western media completely ignores the long-standing and massive body of evidence that's been accumulated of sexual assault in Israeli administrative detention of Palestinians. We don't want to talk about that because we don't want to say that it happens. People want to be able to very simply say these people bad, they rape us, blah blah blah, and ignore the fact that rape is the kind of thing that happens in these circumstances under like imperialism and racism and everything else. When you have these kind of conflicts, yes, people do shitty things to each other. So yeah, some Palestinians may have raped Israelis, but Israelis also rape Palestinians, and this is the problem here is the overall dynamics, the competing ideologies, the racism that's present here, and the power dynamics. That's what's driving it. But people want to take these very narrow visions and jump on things before there's real evidence. So arguments, honestly, that Hamas members mass raped, okay, I won't accept that until there's evidence. But I also won't deny that it's possible. And a lot of Palestinians have done that. They say there's no way they would do that. They're good Muslims. Of course they won't do that. Well, first off, there were 5 groups involved, some of which were not Muslim. Two of the groups attacking on that day are literally fucking communists. But set that aside too. It's more like, it's always like my camp can't do that, my people can't do that, and that's this logic. So when a lot of people react very defensively to the fact that we have documentation of sexual assaults by Israelis against Palestinians in detention, people don't want to talk about that at all because their side can't do it. But you see the same thing among pro-Palestinians. And I would just tell people again, a little suspensive judgment is helpful. Like, wait until we know something instead of immediately drawing on your own confirmation bias. Oh, my side couldn't possibly do that. We wouldn't do that. Only they do that. Well, when you're saying only they do that, you're falling into racist logic. And I see that all the time in people defending Hamas and these other groups from the accusations of sexual assault. On the one hand, yes, I agree. No real evidence has been presented of that. But it's entirely possible it happened because this shit happens constantly in those kind of circumstances.
And we're talking about individuals who are crossing over into territory given a certain set of sovereignty to do whatever they want. Of course you're going to have that. But it definitely, but to use that as a justification for bombing children, to use that as to then take whatever happened on October 7th and apply that to all of Gaza and be like, look what the Gazans did. The Gazans came over and raped our women and raped and killed our children. It's like, okay, under that logic, whatever the United States did in Iraq applies to all of Americans and all the United States. It's like, but it's a very useful.
You're using Al-Qaeda's logic. That's one of the things that's most disturbing about this. And I think we would have an easier time calling this out if we weren't falling into some of these traps ourselves. So if people weren't aggressively defending Hamas and Palestinians from any possibility that they could have done this, it would be intellectually more honest and easier to point to the absolute horror of them using this as a pretext for attacks. Because when you say that all people are somehow collectively responsible for things, it's literally the justification for 9/11. They're using terrorist logic. Well, all Americans could have voted against a government that did this stuff, so all Americans are collectively responsible for this shit.
Yeah.
Why is it okay to use
it's so effective? Unfortunately, it's so effective, though. Unfortunately, I have some of the most liberal friends that I've talked to about this, and they're reasonable people, and on a normal day. But when it comes to this issue, I was telling them, like, it's fucking terrible what's happening to Gaza right now. It's a straight up genocide. And one of them said, "Well, they attacked first, and they got to get rid of Hamas." I'm like, who attacked? The 6-year-olds attacked? The 10-year-olds attacked? The teenagers? The 80-year-old women? They all got together and attacked?
Right.
It's the idea. And mind you, this is a very liberal, progressive friend of mine who lives in Hollywood, for crying out loud. And I'm just like, how do you fall for such a broad, justification, for a fucking genocide? It makes...
and what bugs me about things like that too, that this is where there's a lot of honest ignorance involved in this, because people think, well, it was very peaceful and then Hamas broke the peace and attacked. Okay, what the fuck? They're being attacked constantly. The Strip is invaded every few years systematically. There's constant bombings and assassinations. It never actually ends. This fight started in 1947 and has literally never stopped. So all you're doing, it's resistance. And realistically, peoples have a right to resist. If you want to, especially if you're pointing to like any liberals or whatever, it is a pretty core tenet of liberal political philosophy from John Locke to the present that peoples have a right to resist tyranny. And it is absolutely undeniable that Palestinians live under tyranny. They live under military occupation with military law. They are constantly dispossessed and killed. So as terrible as some of the groups are in their own ideology, I don't agree with Hamas on almost anything. They're a consequence of this whole process. They're literally just a consequence, and you're blaming the victims in a sense. It doesn't excuse attacks on innocents. I will not defend anything that Hamas did in that attack. Crossing over and attacking, because anytime you're shooting up civilians, I have a problem. That's a red line for me. But arguing that they're doing it somehow justifies Israel doing it in response is again using a terrorist logic. You're saying it's okay for us to be the terrorists, just not them.
It's why I hate the whataboutisms in this whole conversation. It's constant whataboutisms. Like, okay, October 7th, innocent people got killed. Automatically with me, check mark, that's terrible. It should not have happened. But, and people on the pro-Palestinian side, I oftentimes will see some people will say, but what about, I'm like, okay, no, you're doing exactly what the pro-Israeli side is doing when it's like, okay, Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza.
Right.
But what about October 7th? It's like, stop with the whataboutisms. What's happening in Gaza? Terrible. Should not be happening. Right. There's no justification for it to happen. What happened 75 years prior? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about each individual thing. Right. Let's stop with the whataboutisms. There's no whataboutism of innocent people getting killed, tortured, maimed, their rights taken away, degradation. There is no whataboutism that justifies any of that.
I think the problem is, well, an answer to this is less that we should deal with each individual event and talk about all those, because there's tons of separate events. There are causal chains linking tons of them. All that can be done. But the problem here ultimately lies in the fact that people want to talk about what the other side did as justification for their atrocities, when the problem is the atrocities themselves. This is just, to me, it's always like a basic principle issue. It's one of the reasons that I've always opposed capital punishment. If you're going to make the argument and make a legal argument that killing is bad, then why is it okay that the police can do it, that soldiers can do it, that the state can execute you? You're saying that killing is okay if you chose to do it. So you don't have a problem with murder at all. But people often use the anger, the resentment, the sense of frustration that they have for being victimized as a way to excuse atrocities. And at the end of the day, that is literally what Zionists are doing. They're using their generational trauma, their history of being victimized by other people, and they're using it to justify what they do to Palestinians. And it's a trap that we fall into. If we're going to criticize what they're doing, don't focus on the particulars of it. Look at the principles. What is the actual ideology here? What's really driving this harm? And it's that sense of using your trauma, your experiences as justification for something that you're going to do to somebody else. And that's just not, it's just not how it, okay, so think of it again too. You guys talk a lot about imperialism in the world, right? So obviously things like the Afghan war and the Iraq war, these things are important topics, right? Think about how those happened. If individuals attacked the US, right? If you have a terror group that stages an attack, then what you need to do is prosecute the people who did that and planned it, right? So you're talking about policing work. You're talking about criminal prosecution. The attack in 9/11 was a criminal act. Bombing children in Afghanistan has fuck all to do with that. it did nothing to stop the problem. All it did was it created more terrorists, because you've got more people that are angry. Shit, you blew up my brother's wedding. Of course I'm angry now, and I'm going to go join a militant movement, right? It's nonsensical. All that just feeds into the military-industrial complex. It keeps the same old imperialist logic going. But the principle behind it, if people can get the principle into their head, you can avoid all these problems. Whether it's the Israel-Palestine conflict or our decision to invade Iraq, it's the same thing. If somebody does something criminal and harms some people in your country, pursue those criminals. Don't bomb other innocents, because all you're doing is doing the same fucking thing they did. You're responding to terrorism with terrorism. And that creates a feedback loop that will keep terrorism going forever. The problem here is mixing up understanding the causal relationship, so explaining something, and justifying. And an explanation and justification are different things. So, for example, if anybody's noticed this, right? Fighting terrorism since 1492, right? All of the places where Native American populations fought back, totally understandable. Like I'm with them 100%. In the same way that my father's family were all supporters of the IRA. If you live in repression, then people will respond to that. It's a natural consequence. It's poverty is a factor, yes, but I would push it further back to injustice as the primary driver, because poverty is also an injustice, and not all the people who are willing to resist or fight back are themselves poor. And certainly tons of money has flown into Hamas over the years. That some of them are pretty well off middle class people. They're not necessarily poor, but they still live in an unjust, racist environment where they see people like them being shot all the time. So of course they're going to push back against that. It makes sense. But at the same time, we have to be cautious of falling into the same arguments that the oppressors and imperialists make. Because as soon as we actually say it is good to do this, there's certain problems, like it's understandable, it's justifiable in a sense. I kind of get it. But at the same time, we have to get to the core causes, the real reasons for this, that the separation of peoples into competing tribes that fight each other. And, it's like this zero-sum competition. I want this land and you're on it, therefore I must eliminate you. Bro, there's plenty of land, Find a way to live in peace with each other. There are other ways to approach this stuff, and that's the key to it. I understand why this shit happens. I still say we should point back to the underlying ideologies, the real causative factors, the capital, the imperialism, the racism that's driving all this stuff. Get rid of that shit. And the more we can ourselves articulate an alternative vision that breaks away from this nation state model, it breaks away from nationalism, then the easier it is to really criticize what's causing the harm in the first place. It is Zionist nationalism. It is the ethno-nationalism that drives the racism, the ethnocratic, the apartheid aspects of this that's driving the genocide. Well, then why respond to it with more nationalism? Respond to it with anti-nationalism. Respond to it with a more cosmopolitan view. Focus on the imperial dimensions, the capital dimensions. What's really driving this? And I think it makes it easier for us to articulate an alternative vision for a better future if we don't keep endlessly recycling the crimes of the past. And I think there's
Well, I was just going to say, in talking with Palestinians and pro-Palestinians, one of the key aspects of this, liberation of the Palestinians involves the eradication of the entire system in Israel that is causing the suppression, all the way from the people who are committing the rapes, the detention of innocent people in these administrative detentions, the random killing of children in the West Bank, and just in general, this ideology that we have to have this two-state solution of where you have these others, Palestinians, and the Jews separated as if they're like two different species of animals that are in a zoo and they need to be kept in two different cages. That whole thing needs to come down.
Yes.
And that's what the pro-Palestinian movement is about. When they talk about from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, it's saying that the entire system between that river and the Mediterranean that is causing suppression needs to be eradicated so both groups can enjoy that peace, but it involves justice.
Yeah.
It has to involve justice because, I made a quote because I was narcissistic like that a long time ago where I quoted myself on my little Facebook profile. One of my narcissistic quotes that I quoted myself on was, "It is better to be entrenched in a war for good than to be imprisoned in an evil peace," right? I wrote that years ago, and I kind of see the pro-Palestinian movement like saying the exact same thing, and it makes me a little proud because my narcissistic side is coming out, like, oh yeah, I was saying that 15 years ago. But the idea being is that it's the loose definition of peace that's being thrown around. We're asking for peace. This stupid word, I mean, the word peace is a great word. Salam, shalom, beautiful concepts. Mm-hmm. And that's the beautiful thing about salam and shalom is that it does not mean just calm. It doesn't mean lack of fighting. What that means is well-being, being treated with dignity.
Yeah.
So they've taken that word peace and used it as this stupid liberal talking point to avoid talking about the injustice that's happened to the Palestinians.
Exactly. And we do that a lot. We find ways to avoid the actual problem over and over again. I think one of the single biggest causes of support for Israel in the Western world is anti-Semitism. Because what it does is, what a lot of these countries have done in supporting Israel wholeheartedly. You can see this in Germany, you can see this in the US, you can see this in Canada. There's just tons of places where the government is going to take the position that they do because it's easier than examining the cultural basis for their own hatred for Jews. When we dealt with the Holocaust, right? Everyone wanted to say all this happened because of Hitler and his racist ideology and all that crap. And you ignore the fact that, 1,800 years of Christian anti-Judaism played a significant part in it. No one wanted to talk about that shit at all. Mm-hmm. You don't want to talk about the fact that most of the people who are out there shooting Jews didn't do it because they believed that the Jews were an inferior race. They did it because they just grew up hating Jews. And
you know who hates to hear that? American Christians hate hearing that, but I say it all the time. Every opportunity I get, talk to my dad about this, I'm like, you know who killed the Jews in the Holocaust? It wasn't Buddhists. It wasn't Muslims. It was Christians. Yep. And they, but when you tell that to an American Christian, most likely you'll get a response very similar to this, like, well, they weren't real Christians. And I'm like, well, they sure thought they were. I mean, I'm sure they thought they were covered by the blood of Christ. I mean, when they were singing the hymns in their church, I'm pretty sure they thought they were Christians. So you can use that for anything. If you're going to say that, well, they weren't real Christians, it's like, well, they were Christian.
It's a no true Scotsman fallacy. All they're doing is, well, you're doing this thing that I don't. Well, okay, so why don't you do it in other contexts? So why don't we say the actions of Daesh or Al Qaeda are the actions of people who aren't real Muslims? Well, honestly, that's just as dumb. They're just a particular type of Muslim that represents a tiny lunatic fringe, just like the KKK were literal fucking Christians who were killing people because of their Christianity. And a lot of Nazis were wearing belt buckles that said "Gott mit uns," like God is with us. Like they believed this shit. They thought God was on their side. And so the key here is to understand the cultural foundations of anti-Semitism. Where does that Judeophobia come from? And realistically, the answer is in Christianity. As hard as that is for people to deal with, and until we deal with that on a much deeper level, until a self-examination manages to purge all of those elements of irrational hatred, whether it's Judeophobia, Islamophobia, racism towards Africans or anything else, like all the different bullshit racisms that exist within the Christian world. Until that self-examination happens, nothing has been solved. Nothing has been corrected. All the hatreds that made the Holocaust possible still exist in Europe. None of them have disappeared. And the problem is all those ideas still circulate around. They're in the US still. They're now, unfortunately, in the Arab world. They're all over the place. We have to find a way to chase these ideas themselves out of circulation. And what people have often done is used support for Israel as a proxy for that hard work. It's easier to say, well, we're going to give Israel a submarine, and that means we're not anti-Semites anymore. No, bro, it don't mean that at all. It don't mean that at all.
I find it ironic because truly, I am so much against what happened in Germany in that whole time period that I've made it a principle of mine where I will not wear Adidas, I will not wear Puma, I will not ever buy a Mercedes or a BMW or a Volkswagen or a Porsche. I keep to this, I legitimately will tell my wife, don't buy me any Puma socks or anything like that. Because then I've held to this for decades now. But then you go to Israel and you see Porsche, you see Mercedes, you see this. Because in my mind, I'm like, to me, those companies represent a time where, look at the time period those were birthed in, these companies, and yet it goes to show that this whole project in Israel has nothing to do with protecting Jews because they're literally patronizing, these European brands that were birthed from Nazism. And Greg was talking, he brought this up, that anti-Semitism is at an all-time high since a long time in Germany, and pro-Zionism is also shooting up on the rise in Germany.
Yeah.
There's a correlation there.
Yeah,
as anti-Semitism rises, Zionism rises.
It's a way of escaping that cultural examination, right? Again, getting out of the harder work. There's on some level. Okay, so the boycott issue. Here's a fun one. So you're using a computer right now to talk to me, right? I'm assuming it's like a Windows or a Mac machine or something.
It's a Windows, right? ThinkPad.
So the architecture in that computer, like the physical structure of its motherboard, the way that it works, IBM did all that. Like the foundations of the x86, microprocessor revolution, the structure that created the personal computer, that's IBM, right?
And they supplied the machines in the Holocaust to keep track of the labor camp,
right? So should we not use computers? I mean, it gets problematic to then.
Well, for me, it's just a brand thing.
I'm fine with that. I'm not going to criticize boycotting any particular brands, anything like that. It's no problem there at all. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, all these things are problematic, and there are deeper problems. There are deeper issues. We need to examine why these companies did what they did, which again takes you back to capital and imperialism, right? And those are your actual enemies, not a particular country, right? I mean, hell, German multinationals are multinationals just like ours. They're manufacturing shit all over the place. A lot of the German cars we're getting aren't manufactured in Germany anymore. So it's there's a much deeper issue behind tons of these things. And the problem is we have a tendency to simplify, to look for the simpler answer. I'll give you another neat one that I've seen from actually even among a lot of Palestinian friends of mine. There's a tendency to use Yehudi, the Yehud, the Jews, right? Have you heard what the Jews have done? When you're talking about the latest thing that happened in Palestine, right?
Right.
But saying Yehudi instead of Yisraeli is a problem. Yeah. Because it includes me. It's saying the Jews are the problem. Yeah. Which then takes on an ethnic dimension. That this ceases to be a problem then between different states, different nationalisms and things like that. Instead of like that conflict there, it takes on this sort of racial cultural element.
Yeah. And not to mention it disenfranchises Jewish people who are supporting Palestinians.
Yeah, a lot of this is very it's not deliberate. Again, a lot of the people I hear that from, they're themselves very, very liberal people. Again, they're often friends of mine. They don't think about it. It's just sort of normalized to think that it's the Jews doing it. But adopting that kind of language falls into a racist trap that the Europeans have laid with all these racist ideologies in the first place. And we have to find a way out of that, because all it does is it's going to spread more irrational hatreds that will make it harder to find a real solution in the long run to this.
And it's going to feed the Zionist machine of paranoia for Jewish people, saying, hey, you see, the whole world hates you. The whole world's suspicious of you. Come over here. Come over here where it's safe.
Every single time Palestinians talk about what the Jews did, it raises hackles in the diaspora. It makes us nervous, right? So in the same way that I've had to have these conversations with friends of mine, I think we all need to have these conversations within pro-Palestinian circles. And when people are having conversations in Arabic, listen to the words that you're using. If you're not talking about Zionism or the Israeli government and are instead talking about what the Jews did, you're falling down an anti-Semitic rabbit hole.
Yep, and you're feeding it. You're feeding what they want. You're feeding this fear.
You're giving them what they need to perpetuate this conflict and keep the diaspora scared. And as long as the diaspora is scared, Israel will keep getting away with whatever it wants. The only way we can actually get Israel to change its ethnocratic character, the way that we can actually break the apartheid laws that exist there, you got to turn world Jewry against them. There's more of us out here than there are in Israel, and our support is vital to them getting away with what they do.
Yeah.
If you stop scaring us, it will be a lot easier to put pressure on governments to change their relationship to the state and hence eventually change the state. And more Israelis have come to the realization, and there's a lot of Israelis who do not like the ethnocratic structure. They are pro-Palestinian and Israelis. There's a lot of them, and they are systematically marginalized. Their voices don't reach us because of this kind of rhetoric. It drowns them out, and they can't make real headroads in their own country, so it has to come from the outside. We're the ones who have to put the pressure on it. Israel will not change on its own.
The one thing I've noticed is this particular movement, especially here in 2024, is very advanced and very progressive in the sense that I see the pro-Palestinian movement keeping it at bay. And a lot of the Palestinians, I mean, all of them, the ones leading the charge on that, of course, are Palestinian themselves, who have spoken, in personal detail about how anti-Semitism always ruins these movements and how they're tired of it. Yep. They're tired of it infiltrating and leaking in, because it's not only the fact that it's evil and it's an evil concept that should not be perpetuated, but also because it is disrespectful to the Palestinians who are suffering under this apartheid colonial project within this genocide that's going on. It's disrespectful to their memory. It's no way of honoring them, and so I see a huge change happening, though. I see that, and it's beautiful. It's just, we have to keep that up till it's fully eradicated, because we're not going to win if we go down that pathway. It's just going to lead to more and more justification, and we need to reach the people who aren't so familiar with this conflict, people who we can bring in to relate. Hey, this is not what the headlines are trying to tell you, a war between Palestinians and Jews. That's not what this is about. This is a war of information. It's a propaganda war going on, where, and it's very intricate in the methodologies used by the pro-Israeli side to propagate this idea that Palestinians are all a bunch of anti-Semites who want all the Jews to die.
Right.
It's a very useful headline that you can feed to your average ignorant American who knows nothing about the concept.
And next thing you know, they're thinking that Hamas is a threat to them too. I mean, I don't know how many people I've run into thinking that they want to kill us all. Are you fucking kidding? They have nothing. They don't give a shit about you at all. they're trying to liberate their homeland. Like, what the fuck?
Exactly.
You? It's like, what did we think that the IRA was going to try to bomb Los Angeles? Like, what the fuck, you know?
Yeah.
But it's pretty easy to, when you have this kind of fear circulating around, when anti-Semitism still circulates around, it's pretty easy for them to feed into the Islamophobia and the racism towards Arabs. So it's all ultimately really, really problematic. I have seen a lot of positive signs there, and I think it's one of the reasons that we're making more progress, that it's harder to shut us down than it has been in the past. There is a kind of McCarthyism in the U.S. on the Palestine issue, where there are constant efforts to suppress discussion of this, and it happens every time there's a flare-up in the area. And I've gone through quite a few cycles of this by now, you know, having, you know, been an activist through both of the intifadas and everything else, you know. I'm not a young man anymore. You know? And every time this,
at least you still have your hair.
Well, yeah, exactly. I hit the genetic lottery that way. I'm graying very slowly, and I still have my hair.
Keep rubbing it in. Keep rubbing. No,
I just feel lucky. You know? It is what it is.
You and Greg come on with your full set of hair, and I'm just like I've seen comments like I'm the one that balances out all the hair in this podcast.
Right. My I'm sure my younger brother's unhappy about that too, because he's heading in your direction. But no, we've gone through this repeatedly, over and over and over again. The same shit happens. And it has to stop at some point. And I think one of the reasons that we're doing better this time, that it's harder to shut us up, because they're trying. They keep trying to shut it down, but it doesn't work as well. And I think the moves that have happened within the pro-Palestine camp to push back against these racist discourses have had a marked effect. They've helped. Hamas did a tremendous amount of damage to the Palestine cause in the world by including references to the protocols of the Elders of Zion in their 88 covenant. There's no way around that. They deliberately, they did a lot of damage, right? And by holding to that, by refusing to change it for a long time, by digging in and saying, well, no, this is just reasonable to us, they were deliberately doing harm to the Palestine cause. And that's something that I think people are beginning to wake up to. And I've seen that not only in groups like that, because again, in the 17 version, they've taken it out. They're making efforts. There are still members who are problematic. I still see some horrifying statements made by Palestinian sheikhs and members of Hamas, because those ideas, once they exist, they're hard to get rid of. I give a lot of credit to the movement, though, for putting work into this now, and trying to push back against it, because the longer those discourses go uncriticized, the longer they go unchecked, the deeper their claws sink in and the harder they're to get rid of. Which is why, again, there's no getting rid of anti-Semitism in Europe right now. I mean, the anti-Semitism is just a fundamental part of European culture, because it was such an important part of Christian identity for so fucking long. That to get rid of it is going to take a long time, even if you get the much more serious self-examination. That we can start making progress on this so much faster in the Arab world and in the pro-Palestine camp is a really positive sign that we're doing the right thing. And it's one of the reasons I was happy to have a conversation on this, and whatever pieces of this you can use for your podcast, great, because these are conversations we have to have. If we can more effectively police this stuff and keep this racism out of our discourse, it will actually really help to raise the profile of the Palestine movement. Support for Israel has fallen generationally in the U.S., but support for Palestine hasn't gone up until very recently. It stayed very low. And we need to widen that. We need more people to give a shit about Palestinians. And as long as they can argue with the same Islamophobic bullshit and that they hate Jews and everything else, anything that they can latch onto for that, it makes it harder.
Yeah.
So we're doing good work, but we do need to push harder on this, because at the end of the day, for anybody who's listening to this, even if you can't get yourself to not feel that way, be selfish about it and think that what you're doing is harming the Palestinians. And if you want to free Palestine, you can't do it as long as those ideas exist, because all it's going to do is it's going to feed Christian Zionism and diaspora Zionism.
I was making this point on our last podcast with Michael Schertzer, about how the importance. Oh shit! What was I going to say? I had a train of thought. Oh yeah, sorry. Start over one more time. So I was making. I have bad ADHD. It's insane. I was making this point on our last podcast. With Michael Schertzer about how the Palestinians have given such a great off-ramp for Jewish people who want nothing to do with Zionism anymore. They've created a safe corridor for them to leave. And I see it as one of the greatest, breakthroughs we've had in this whole conflict is this final exodus out of Zionism in the Jewish community. And I have the Palestinians to thank for that. They have created the safe corridor. They've made it very clear by articulating, we do not hate the Jews. Just because you're Jewish does not mean you're our enemy. The enemy is Zionism. The enemy is this racism, this colonialism, this imperialism that you are not a part of just because you're Jewish. And Palestinians have been leading the charge on that. And I gave them a shout out in the last episode, and I want to make it again. It's that they are changing history by doing that. Yeah. Because for the longest time, Jews were imprisoned in this Zionist camp, and if they left, they were seen as a traitor or a self-hating Jew. Yep. And Palestinians have said, no, come over here. It's safe over here. You just because you're Jewish, you know what? We'll have challah bread with you as we discuss how we liberate Palestine. It is not about the Jews. And my experience in Israel, when I was over there and I was in the Palestinian territories, there were some anti-Semites that I came across on the Palestinian side, but 99 out of 100 of them made it very clear to me when I was talking with them, like, we love the Jews. Before a lot of the expulsions from our land, I had a Jewish best friend. We shared cultures together. We shared holidays. It was nothing about that. Yeah. But so they made it clear to me on that. And I had a Jewish friend of mine who was Sephardic Jewish. He was Farsi from New Jersey. He could pass off as an Arab, as a lot of different cultures. So we were walking in the Palestinian territories, and my Palestinian friends knew that he was Jewish. And watching the dynamics between the two, how there was no anti-Semitism in that exchange, or even when behind closed doors, when they knew I wasn't Jewish, they knew I was a white boy Christian from America, they still expressed to me that they had nothing against Jewish people. It was just a Zionist machine. So, while anti-Semitism does exist in the movement and amongst Palestinians, my personal experience among them has been where they didn't have a hating bone in their body, Yeah,
and that's the thing that we need to keep building on. And the more that we can improve that, the more that it actually helps the whole world's view. When I was a kid, if Palestinians were discussed in the media at all, it was only as terrorists. They hijacked airliners, this or that. That was the only way anybody ever heard of them. No one talked about why. No one talked about them as victims of settler colonialism. They were just irrational terrorists. And there's an element of that persists to the present day that makes it hard for a lot of Americans to respond to, embrace, really find sympathy with Palestinians. And I think the more that we improve those anti-racist credentials, the easier that argument gets. And the more that, again, I like the way you put it, as it gives an escape route for Jews who want to undo their own Zionist programming. Because, again, a lot of it is based in generational trauma and fear, right? A lot of Jews are frankly terrified because of how the world has treated us over and over and over again. It has not stopped, because, again, it's dug in very deep roots in the European imaginary, in the Christian world. And it's extended outward from there and infected whole new areas. I knew tons of Palestinians who knew I was Jewish and embraced me anyway, and treated me like a brother. And I loved that. But I also met people who thought all the Jews should go back to Europe, and that the Jews are the enemy. And I heard the same kind of awful shit too. They're a minority voice, but they exist. They
exist. Yeah.
And the more that shit exists, the more problematic it is. I've seen, like, stalls in the Arab world, and we're often outside of Palestine too. So I've seen this shit in Egypt and whatnot. You know, you're selling books and whatnot. There are people selling translations of Mein Kampf and selling little portraits of Hitler. You know, that shit hurts us. You know, it's a small,
just like you have in the United States, just like you have in bookstores in the Deep South. You'll have Mein Kampf. You'll have white supremacist groups propagating this stuff.
In the U.S.,
So under that logic, then don't trust. Then label all of us white people as anti-Semites. Then, well, you know, under that logic, go ahead and do that, because that's more accurate, actually, in my opinion.
No, honestly, again, a lot of people do. It's the main justification for Zionism, because a lot of people, even if you're not the one waving the swastika, I look at you and I see a person who could be waving a swastika. I don't know if you don't secretly idolize Hitler. There's a kind of irrational fear that exists in the back of a lot of Jews' heads because of the way that we've been treated for so long. And even though, again, they're minority voices, they have to be called out from inside. So it needs to be other Egyptians that walk up and tear up those Hitler pictures. As long as that's okay. Just like, for me, I need to be out there beating up Nazis. You know, when people are walking down the street with a fucking swastika, that's a problem. And this culture should not tolerate it. This should not tolerate it. And this, again, while again, they are minority voices, they have a disproportionately negative effect on the Justice for Palestine movement.
Yes, because you know that the propaganda on the other side is going to hone in and zero in on that comment and blow it up and give it this disproportional perspective that, oh, that must be like 50% of them. I mean, I remember when I was in Palestine in the West Bank, and I was with a bunch of Palestinian friends. Most of those friends had obviously expressed to me that they have nothing against Jewish people, but there was one guy, and he was a little off. Everybody knew that he was a little off. He was kind of like the outcast, crazy guy. He was spewing some anti-Semitic stuff. And guess what? All the other Palestinians were like, yo, shut the fuck up, you dumbass. Like, okay. And they told me, like, Mark, don't pay attention to that guy. He's fucking nuts. And everybody knew that he was like the crazy one, the anti-Semitic one. So yes, just like in American culture, you're going to have that guy who's like, hey, you know who's controlling stuff? You know, all the stuff that's going on in the world? Yeah, it's the Jews. And then we're like, okay, God, you just ruined the whole conversation. Right. And that same type of thing happens in Palestine, obviously, where you have a group of Palestinian friends talking about all the fucked up shit going around the world. And you'll have that one Palestinian be like, it's the Jews. And he's like, shut the fuck up. You know, like no, it's not. But we all know who that guy is. So it's just like you said, it's a matter of keeping that guy in his little closet so he can go through all his Jewish conspiracy theories to himself, you know, out of the fucking movement.
Yeah, it's hard, you know. I mean, even with somebody like me who is a knee-jerk cosmopolitan who doesn't like tribalism of any sort. Hell, I couldn't even wrap my head around competitive team sports. I just don't get the point. You know, like even me, I'm not completely immune to some of the fear that circulates around. There have been so many statements I've seen where people do use words like the Jews, you know, and even if you don't mean it that way, even if you're talking about Zionists, just that simple slip like that, that's the reason I've got a Star of David on my door. You know, I mean, it makes me more willing to, hey, hello, this is me, you know. It kind of gets you that whole let's circle the wagons and defend ourselves. And at the end of the day, that's what creates a slippery slope into Zionism for people. The more scared we are, the more we fall for Zionist propaganda. Yes. If you want to do the opposite, if you want to pull people out of Zionist propaganda, then you need to really work on the whole anti-racist lines. Make it very clear. Yes. And again, I give credit. There's a lot of positive work that's been done to improve that in the last couple of decades. But it got pretty bad before that started to turn around. And it means that we do have people in our camp that are problematic. And we have to find a way to call that out.
And from my experience, the people that talk like that, and this is just my personal, you know, anecdotal take on it, of the people who talk about the Jews, you discuss what's happening in Gaza or to the Palestinians, they usually don't care about the Palestinians. Like, they don't care about the human suffering. They just care about their own personal hate and their own, it's like they're prioritizing their hate over the care of humanity. And that's the pattern that I see with anti-Semites, is that these anti-Semites, they don't give two shits about these kids dying in Gaza. They don't give two shits about the suffering actually from the Palestinians. They just care about their own hate or their own, paranoia.
I had one good Palestinian friend that, super liberal guy, no, doesn't have a hateful bone in his body,
Right.
His own father had to correct him and say, no, you're supposed to say Yisraeli, not Yehudi. And he what? And I had never really thought about it, because it's just normal. You repeat the language that you hear. This is why racism's work the way they do. People grow up around certain language, and it just becomes normalized, and it gets very hard to unpick that later. There's always a sense of fear, distrust, that those people are different from me. It starts very early on. And one of the easiest things we can do to start changing our own thinking is on some level to alter our language, catch the words that we use, because there are consequences to using certain phrases, unconscious consequences. And the next thing you know, you might find yourself justifying attacks on Jews, and that's not going to help anybody. So for people listening and thinking about this, understand that, we too agree that the Palestinian movement has been getting much, much better on this issue. And there's marked change in the last 20 years. And the better we can get at that, the better we can weed this stuff out, the better it's going to be for all the Palestinians, because we'll win the argument in the diaspora. If you can win the argument in the US, Canada, Europe, whatever, if you can change the minds of Jewish populations in those areas, we've won. Palestine will have won.
Doc, I appreciate you talking about this. It's a very hairy topic. It's very complicated. It's like untangling fishing line. One of my pet peeves is when I see a comment. I've seen a comment on this issue where it's saying, "Hey, don't talk about this issue. It's a little bit too hot. It's inappropriate right now." It's like, no, fuck off. We need to talk about it. This is how we sharpen. This is how we become better as a movement. This is how we perfect our goals and clearly outline our goals, by having these difficult conversations about things that pop up in the movement that need to be eradicated. So no, for all those who are saying that, no, we should not talk about that right now. It's like, well, we kind of do, because right now there are people suffering in Gaza right now. They're starving to death, and we don't need some jackass coming in the conversation spewing some anti-Semitic bullshit just to derail the movement. Don't want that. So we're gonna have to have these difficult conversations, and there's the comment section is gonna be blowing up on this, so people all have all kinds of opinions on it. But hey, let's have the conversation. Let's do that.
Exactly.
Let's not cower away.
And at the end of the day, I get why some people emotionally might think, well, it's too much sympathy for the Israelis or Jews and this and then we want to talk about our pain. I get that. I really do. So for people like that who have that kind of reaction, if it helps, think of it in entirely self terms. Think about it that not policing this stuff is literally making it harder for people like me to make arguments to Americans to change their minds. I want to be able to have conversations with other American Jews on this issue and help them to sympathize with the Palestinians. And as long as they can point to someone talking about this and talking about Jewish conspiracies and everything else, the harder that it makes it. I mean, and I can say, yes, they're a minority, whatever, but they're there. And at the end of the day, it's the same reason that a lot of people are afraid living here, because there are still rabid anti-Semites living among us in this country and in Europe. And they may be a minority, but they're still lethal. And their existence feeds Zionism.
Yep.
And if we want to defeat Zionist nationalism and create a more cosmopolitan shared future, we have to do what we can, what little bit we can do to help to alleviate those fears, to break those cycles the cycle. And it's when people are responding that way, defending, saying it's the wrong time to talk about this. They're angry. They're upset. What's happening is it's giving into the generational traumas that ultimately are no different from what happens with the Israelis, because every single time an attack happens there, people remember all the other pogroms that have targeted us. And it's not fair. The Palestinians didn't do all that stuff. They didn't cause any. I totally understand that. And at the end of the day, if you can have these conversations, most Jews understand that too. But it feeds that fear. And fear is a potent motivator. It drives people into extremist politics. So we help the Palestine cause by having difficult conversations like this.
I 100% agree, Doc, and that's why we called you. I'm glad you answered the Jedi calling.
We've rambled on for quite a while here, so we should probably.
We did. This is the longest podcast we've ever done, but I'm glad we did. I'm glad I got to trick you into
talking too much,
staying longer. No, I loved it. I loved every bit of it, Doc. So, again, we'll sign off on this. I think we covered a lot of ground. Again, I could spend hours talking to you about all kinds of stuff, but I know you got to get up early. So, with that, that's the only reason why I'm ending that, is because you have to get up early. I would still be talking to you till midnight. But, anyways, sir, love you a bunch. People love you. People love soaking in everything that you have to teach, and I encourage everybody watching this, go check out the After Hours with the Mad Professor. God damn, I did it again.
I totally want to. I want to do a nightclub now.
Office Hours with the Mad Professor. Jesus Christ, I got to get better at this whole public speaking thing. I really do.
No,
Office Hours with the Mad Professor. After Hours is probably. Don't go to After Hours. We have no idea what.
Yeah, that sounds like a much more racy channel.
If you're gonna go check out that channel, After Hours, after whatever you're doing, get done with it, and then come back to the Office Hours with the Mad Professor. So, anyways. Doc, love you a whole bunch. I hope to see you again soon. We'll have some more stuff to, pick your brain about whenever you have time. So, God bless you, sir.
Have a great night.
Take care. All right.
Long and prosper.